All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force, Whatcom County. Before we begin, we do want to read this land acknowledgement statement that we acknowledge we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. So we begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present, and ask you to please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. So welcome, everyone. A special welcome to our state legislators who are with us. We're really delighted. Thank you so much, Senator Sefcik. I pronounced it correct. All right. And of course, Representative Rammel and Shoemaker, it's great to see you. And of course, all the other task force members. And I believe our agenda will go as it was published, and we're going to actually start out with the legislative update. And I think Stephen I think that's in part, so we don't want you to feel at all bound. You're welcome to stay, but I think in part it was to make the best use of your time to do this and to give you an opportunity to leave if you have to do other things, but you're of course welcome to stay. But we wanted to do this at the beginning. And with that, Stephen, I will turn that over to you.
Thank you, Jack. And I'll add my welcome to Senator Sefcik and Representative Shoemaker and Rammel. Just as a bit of background, you recall in the task force just about a year ago, we began a fairly intense and extended series of conversations over a broad package of legislation that had passed in the 2021 session, dealing with law enforcement, criminal justice, and dealing with many of the intersecting issues that had been a matter of public concern for some time at that point. We were honored by visits and discussions with some of our elected representatives last spring. The session this year was, as promised, active in taking another look at many of the bills that had passed in 2021, and quite a number of changes were made. So we're very pleased to have back our legislators to sort of give us a summary of what the thinking was in the legislature as you went about your work on these bills, what was passed, what was proposed and not passed, and why. And I'll also note that Under Sheriff Doug Chadwick is with us and is prepared to provide a perspective from law enforcement in the sheriff's office on the results of the session. And I'll also note that Chief Tanksley, Blaine Police Chief, is with us as well. The chief's been on a state law enforcement task force, and so welcome his input as well. So maybe I'll start, I'll start with our more senior representatives, either Representative Shoemaker, Representative Rammel, whichever one of you would like to start off and tell us what went on in the 2022 session here.
I can start, or you want me to go ahead and start, Sharon? Great, thanks. And thank you so much for the invitation to come and connect. And I hope we get to have a chance to keep talking about this as we get to implementation, because I think as we saw last year, the implementation of the policies that the legislature passes is really where the rubber meets the road, and we need to keep our eye on this and make sure that, that we've got things in the right place and continue working together. So appreciate the chance to come and connect. So I'll just start off briefly with a quick summary, let Representative Shoemaker and Senator Sefcik jump in and fill in any details. Do our best to answer questions, but just quick refresher and a reminder. following the murder of George Floyd, there was unprecedented call for the legislature to act, for local governments to act, federal government to act across this country. It's a historic civil rights moment, and I think it's really important to keep ourselves grounded in the urgency, the immediacy, and the importance of that call to action. I hope everybody involved in this work took some of those lessons to heart and is continuing to hold on to that civil rights call for action. The legislature last year passed about a dozen different pieces of legislation related to law enforcement accountability. And most of those, I think, have been implemented relatively painlessly. However, and the reason that we're here today is because a couple of those, there was uncertainty, unclarity in two pieces of that legislation. One related to use of force and one related to law enforcement tactics. And so this would spent last year having these conversations with almost everybody on the call today has been involved in those. We took a lot of feedback, and the legislature, when we convened this January, had a number of different proposals on the table to address some of the different pieces there. And I think we, of the things that were on my to-do list coming out of conversations with almost every law enforcement agency in the 40th district and some beyond, we got most of the things that were done on my to-do list. There might be one outstanding that I'll get to in a moment. But the big pieces that we passed, first one was easy. There was just an oversight when we passed the law enforcement tactics legislation that indicated that 50 caliber weapons were prohibited. I think what we all meant and what most people knew we meant was bullets, but there were some folks that said beanbags are actually larger than that. And so these less lethal beanbag shotguns that are used as an alternative to other more deadly, more serious uses of force were actually interpreted as being prohibited. So we clarified that and passed that legislation, I think, relatively painlessly. We passed two pieces of legislation that addressed some of the challenges with the law enforcement use of force. The first one was 1735, introduced by Representative Johnson. And I think this was perhaps the most concerning piece for me personally in thinking about this, that the way that the use of force language had been written last year, what it did was inadvertently seemed to prohibit police from using force in an involuntary treatment order or other sort of care, police law enforcement caretaking functions, where there wasn't violence or threat of violence, but somebody was behaving in a way that was perhaps disturbed, where there was a court order or legal order requiring them to act. Police could not put hands on them to enforce those orders. So we clarified that. I think that was important. My sense is that it's a small percentage of cases, but in those cases, it's very important to have law enforcement involved and to have that option as a sort of a last resort. It also establishes that bill also establishes a reasonable care standard for those circumstances, which I think is a reasonable and appropriate sort of middle ground. We also passed a second bill related to the use of force. That's Representative Goodman's 2037. And I will tell you all that, quite frankly, this is probably the piece of legislation that I hemmed and hawed over more than anything I've worked on since joining the legislature. I went back and forth in how I thought about this more times than I can count. This fundamental challenge here is when you go out and talk to law enforcement agencies, they'll tell you in particular about domestic violence cases, where there is a reasonable suspicion that there's crime been committed. Officer arrives on the scene. There's some chaos. You don't know where everybody is in a building or on a property. You just need people you identify to sit down, perhaps handcuff them while you ascertain the situation, make sure it's safe. There is not yet a probable cause standard in those cases. And but there is reasonable suspicion. We ultimately decided to return the probable cause standard, largely because of stories like that we heard from law enforcement agents. The counterpoint to that, and really what made that so difficult for me, is that I think we have a fair amount of evidence looking at law enforcement nationally that when reasonable suspicion is the standard, it has a racially disproportionate impact. That's something that's very, very difficult. That's what made it such a difficult decision on our end. Ultimately, that legislation did pass, and what you'll most frequently hear this referred to is the case of Terry stops. I think we put some more serious safeguards around the use of that probable cause, that reasonable suspicion standard. But it is one that probably will continue to remain a little bit controversial. The last piece of legislation that I'll talk about relates to police pursuits. That was a Senate bill 5919. Ultimately, that did not pass. So you may have heard the sort of shorthand that says police aren't allowed to engage in vehicle pursuits. That is not accurate, but it is more difficult now than it was 2 years ago. And we had contemplated legislation that, again, would interact with that standard probable cause versus reasonable suspicion. That legislation came over from the Senate. A different version passed the House, and in the reconciliation process, the bill ultimately did not advance, and so we did not pass that. What I want to clarify on that point, I think we'll probably continue to work on that in the future, but would really emphasize that most of the law enforcement agencies that I talked to in communicating about this legislation said we only have a handful of these high-speed vehicle pursuits, if any, on an annual basis. They're rare. There are other options for how to apprehend bad guys in those circumstances, radioing ahead, those kinds of things to slow down. And the concern ultimately is that these high-speed chases, more than 40% of them, end in a crash and injury. Oftentimes to somebody who wasn't involved, neither the officer nor they just hit a pedestrian or another vehicle. So there really is a serious concern about this. A lot of law enforcement agencies I heard from said, we avoid those at all costs. The last thing I'll emphasize that we did accomplish this year that I think is important. We've heard consistently about challenges with getting new police officers, new law enforcement officers recruited and into the queue. It's a long and complicated process to become a law enforcement officer, and we want to continue to hold that high standard, but we want to do the best we can to accelerate that. It's challenging to hire people in lots of sectors right now, and law enforcement is no exception. But the one thing the state legislature can do right now on that is to fund additional training classes with the Law Enforcement Academy. And so we more than doubled the number of cohorts that will be funded in the coming year, adding another 13 classes. So I'll pause there and let the other legislators fill in what I missed or tell me what I got wrong. Really appreciate the chance to be here and connect with you all.
Thank you, Representative Rammel. Representative Shoemake, anything you want to add from the House side?
Sure. Alex did a great job summarizing. One of the things that I think is a new addition that I'd just like to put a little bit of emphasis on is that we also defined when force is being used. So when we stated when you can use force, I met with every police chief that would meet with me in Whatcom County. I didn't realize that, is touching someone force, like is moving them along those lines, is that force? And so we defined it to not include a pat down, not include incidental touching, verbal commands, or when you handcuff someone and it doesn't harm them, right? So there's still more tools that police can use in a way that doesn't hurt someone, but really keeps that scene safe. And that's something that I learned from some of the people on this call about that being really important. The other piece too is, in addition to the extra training, the Law Academy, sorry, it's been a morning and I just heard my mother-in-law wake up, distractions at home. But in addition to that, we also put some extra money into the state patrol, into those salaries. We've done a salary survey and they were on lower than they should be than their cohorts. And so I think that's really important to do that. And then there were some other pieces that we did with some of the law and fire retirees and increasing those benefits.
Thank you, Representative Shoemake. Senator Sefcik, I turn to you. You have, for a variety of reasons, perhaps some different perspectives on this. You didn't get a year of conversing with community representatives. You're over in the other chamber, on the other side of the aisle. So explain how some of these matters look to you during the session.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Stephen, and thank you everyone for having me. Really appreciate this opportunity, and good to meet some of you, even if it's through a camera lens. So good to be with each one of you. One of the interesting things about this whole process is, as has been mentioned before, this is a question of balance, right? This is a question of how do we give our law enforcement officers the tools that they need to protect the public and to do their job, while at the same time protecting different potentially vulnerable communities. And it is a tricky subject. It is something, however, that from the law enforcement that I've talked to in Whatcom County, post-session, something that they do not feel enough progress has been made on in this area. And I don't get a sense that there's satisfaction on the way the session came out for some of those areas that Rep. Rommel touched on earlier. I think 5919, the vehicular pursuit one, was really an issue that law enforcement would have wished would have been brought, and unfortunately by essentially one vote, it failed in the Senate, which is going to be another year where law enforcement don't feel as though they have the tools to do what they need to do, and so there is some dissatisfaction with those areas. Another area of dissatisfaction was with Bill 5841, which had to do with increasing incentives for the number of law enforcement officers. I'm glad it sounds like everybody here agrees that we need to be doing that, not just in the state patrol, but in different areas across the state. And so there was also some dissatisfaction that didn't get pushed through further. But the other aspect that we have to keep in mind is that this whole use of force issue goes back to, I'm not sure if it was mentioned earlier, I believe it's a 1968 Supreme Court case called Terry v. Ohio, which has to do with Terry stops. Don't quote me on it being 1968 or 1961. It's in the 60s, I believe. But it has to do with the use of force, as whether that's determined by reasonable suspicion or probable cause, in the same way that you have different legal standards in a courtroom if you were suing somebody. And so the law enforcement officers are happy that we made some progress on that. But overall, like I said, I think there's a dissatisfaction in some of the way the conversations occurred. And I think it was mentioned earlier, while I wasn't there in the stakeholdering process, in the form of a legislative capacity a year ago, one of the things I did hear was that, as implementation is difficult. This was, and some of these issues that we tried to address this session is something that law enforcement warned our legislators about a year ago and said that this is potentially going to be a problem. And their feeling, at least, and I don't want to necessarily speak for them, but the impression I got is they feel as though some of those concerns were ignored, and as a result, many people had to pay the consequences in terms of potential crime numbers. And so obviously the one other thing I'll mention, each one of you probably saw that in a nationwide ranking, Bellingham, I believe, was ranked 3rd highest in terms of property crime in the entire country and in terms of American cities recently. And I believe I saw a report in the past couple of days saying that car theft has increased by about 300% in Bellingham as opposed to last year. So there are certain causes to those things, some of which are at the legislative level, some of which have to do with other circumstances. But I just think it's important for us to remember that, you know, the decisions we make in the legislature, the tools we give our law enforcement have real human consequences to the victims of crime, and we need to be compassionate to those individuals, and we need to look towards ways to address those. And so I think we made some good progress, but I think we still have several steps that we need to take in order to address a lot of the concerns that I've heard continually from law enforcement, who feel as though this session was not an overall win in terms of public safety. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Sefcik. Representative Shoemake.
Just to clarify, so Senator Sefcik mentioned the Terry stop, and that was restored with 2037. So police officers can do that.
Thank you. I want to get involvement from other task force members in due course, but I'd like to hear on the legislative session from Under Sheriff Chadwick, Chief Tanksley, and I see Prosecutor Ritchie has come on and would welcome his views also. Doug, you want to add some comments here?
Absolutely. Good morning to all the members, and thank you to our Senators Sefcik and Representative Shoemake and Rammel. Thank you for being here. Again, as everybody knows, last year there were 13 major police reform bills that moved through and were enacted. And again, we had to adjust to that. And obviously, as the senator had mentioned, there was a lot of input from WASPIC last year about what they believe some of those consequences may be. And I think we're seeing in this most recent legislative session that I think everybody acknowledged that, yes, there were some unfortunately unintended consequences. And I appreciate our senators and our representatives working hard to find some fair and balanced solutions to some of those, specifically the three bills that just were enacted by the governor. As far as the pursuit bill, that again was something we were hopeful that we were going to see some changes, because again, it does create challenges. Within the last month, we had deputies tried to stop vehicles, lights, and turn their lights on and try to initiate a traffic stop. And in one evening, 7 people fled from our deputies. That's significant. We've all seen it. We look at the news, and here in Western Washington and Whatcom County, we see it, we feel it, and it is impacting public safety. So again, we appreciate the changes. Obviously, we now have some less lethal options that we didn't have a year ago. And again, the clarification when it comes to use of force in both a criminal situation and a civil community caretaking function is helpful and provides some clarification for our deputies so that they know where they stand and are able to do their job effectively and help support the behavioral health community that's out there trying to get folks the help they need where they're at. So that's really what we've seen here. But again, I know the sheriff would have been here today. Unfortunately, he was out of the area, but we tried to highlight here essentially a snapshot in time, but we are seeing crime go up here, property crime, as well as some of our violent crime here in Whatcom County. So it's concerning, and we will continue to work within the framework that we're being asked to and do what we can to impact public safety.
Thank you. Chief Tanksley, comments from you.
Yes, thanks everyone. So, here in Blaine, I'll just start off by saying in 2021 and 2020, we didn't have a single stolen vehicle. 2022, we've had four. That might not seem like a lot for some people, but it's a big deal here in Blaine. And right now, I don't know the exact cause, but I would potentially say with all the news about pursuing vehicles and not being able to, that might have something to do with it. And then again, it might have something to do with the catalytic converter theft that's going on. But I will say, we are disappointed that SB 5919 was not passed. I can tell you in 2021 here in Blaine, we had a burglary of a storage unit, and it was in the middle of the night, and the officers actually saw the burglars enter a vehicle with multiple items. A pursuit did ensue, and it ended up in unincorporated Whatcom County. And the burglars had just stolen a cache of weapons from a storage facility. And those subjects were arrested and they're being held accountable. Today, as we speak, that pursuit could not happen. And there be guns on the street. Our officers are highly trained. Pursuits are dangerous, and we do terminate during certain factors. So I would say that with the current pursuit policy statewide, I think we just really have to educate our communities about what to expect from a law enforcement officer. And what I have seen over the last year is that when we explain to a person why we cannot pursue a car, a lot of people are shocked. So like Under Sheriff Chadwick said that, we have to operate under the parameters that we have, and we will. But I do think we really need to take a look at this pursuit law and see how we could really protect people, not just property, but protect people in general. Thank you.
Can I speak for a second, Stephen? So I'm assuming that's a yes, he was on mute, but it looks like a yes. One of the bills that we also
It was
passed.
a yes. Sorry.
I can Zoom lip read. But one of the pieces that we also passed was 1840 to address this rise in catalytic converter thefts. So there's some study aspects of it, but there's also, we're going to start asking people to mark the catalytic converters and make sure that the people who are buying them are able to be held accountable. So we're really trying to get at that market piece of it to make this less profitable and something that people aren't doing as much. And Chief, I really appreciate you're discussing the vehicle pursuit. We sent that over to the Senate, and I don't know the full story of why that didn't pass, but we are frustrated with that too. One of the things I would ask is, so when we talk about vehicle thefts, is that impacted by the legislation, or like how does that fit in? And how could we work on that? Like, what are your ideas?
Well, I think the increase in crime overall might be due to some extent, the lack of being able to enforce certain crimes. And there's been many law enforcement agencies and reps across the state have shown that they've apprehended criminals, and the criminal has said, the person has said, I did this because we know that you cannot do X, Y, and Z. So I think that's happening far more than we realize. Now, one pursuit is too many pursuits. We would hope to not have a pursuit, but we have to apprehend people sometimes.
Okay, thanks, that helps.
And Representative Rammel, and then Under Sheriff Chadwick have comments.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to put a little bit of context to my understanding of what happened with 5919. So it did pass the Senate. I assume Senator Sepsic voted for it over there. It was passed out of the House in a slightly different version. Rep. Shoemake and I both voted for it. And I think our whole delegation voted for it in each of those chambers. When it got back to the conference committee, it got loaded up with amendments that frankly were unrelated to pursuit. They're related to other areas of use of force. And what was then presented as a conference report did not have the votes to pass. So one, that is a frustrating thing about the legislative process. But what I would take away from that for everybody on this call is that if you're just talking about the question, do we want to change that standard for police pursuits? I think there's the support for that in the legislature. It's when you combined it with these other tangentially related amendments that it became difficult. So that is a frustrating thing about the legislature. It happens on bills all the time. And that's the context for it. The other thing I just really wanted to highlight, because I think it is concerning. I saw the same article in the Herald about the increase in stolen vehicles in Bellingham. I did a little bit of digging. Vehicle theft since the start of the pandemic, for one reason or another, has been up across the whole country. There may be blips locally or regionally, but it is a trend that is happening all over the United States. So it is a more complicated thing than any one set of local or state policies. Thanks.
Thank you. That was interesting additional information on the sausage making around 5919. Appreciate that.
Well, Stephen, I'd like to jump in. I haven't had my chance yet.
Yeah, Doug, do you mind holding on? Okay, yeah, Eric, you were in the middle of a lot of the analysis, and your last year and your perspective as a prosecutor is unique here. So let us know how the session looked from your office.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank Sharon and Alex and Simon for being here today. It's really great to hear from you, to hear how this all went. Most of us have been following the legislation very closely because it impacts what we do. And anyway, I really appreciate you coming here and talking to us. 1735, that was great. I kind of saw it coming. I mean, essentially that was correcting a mistake. I know we're calling it clarification, but I mean, as it came out, it was, as an unintended consequence of what was presented. And anyway, I appreciate you fixing that. 5919, yeah, we're disappointed in that too, because it is, I mean, our police, they need more latitude. They just do. They can make these decisions. They know they can decide what's safe. And it's very rare that we have a situation where somebody gets injured here in Whatcom County. I know we have an example, but it's been very, very rare. 2037, I want to thank you for bringing back Terry. That's going to help us quite a bit, because we need that. We need it because we have a new brazen criminal out here on the street. That's the way I see it. We have people who are just thumbing their nose at what we do. And the reason why they're doing it is because they know that there's no chase. They know that there are limited repercussions. Store owners, they have their liability issues. They're concerned about, getting sued. So they're not stopping people and holding them. So that's hurting law enforcement from being able to do stuff. Of course, we have booking restrictions as well in our jail. So people are, they know that if they are caught, they're not going to go to jail right away. And that's the most, I think, impactful point for them. And then of course, during COVID, we've had no trials, and that's given, provided no accountability. And so that's been really hard. I can tell you that Bellingham Prosecutor's Office and Whatcom County Prosecutor's Office, we've been working together. We're talking about how to identify the people who are most involved in the property crime so that we can give them the most appropriate attention from the criminal justice system. And when I say that, what I'm saying is we're talking about identifying people who need felony convictions and more time in our prisons, because we have as I said, a brazen criminal out there that's running rampant. We need to do more for our community. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Doug, thanks for your patience.
Absolutely. Just to circle back to what Representative Shoemake brought up, if there's anything, when you go back to session next time, when it comes to the pursuits, some things to consider. And I know when we met with you previously, the sheriff and I talking about pursuits, trying to go back to that reasonable suspicion standard as opposed to probable cause, but also we're limited to violent crimes and serious crimes as defined in the RCW. So that's a short list of crimes. It doesn't include things like residential burglary, domestic violence, stolen vehicles. So again, as Prosecutor Ritchie alluded to, we are dealing with a significant uptick in emboldened criminals that know that we can't pursue, that we can't stop, that we can't, thankfully if we actually contact them, we now have the tools to detain them while we do further investigation to get to that standard of probable cause. But again, having the probable cause and limited to violent crimes and serious crimes has really impacted our ability to arrest people and hold them accountable. And as Chief Tanksley said, our officers and deputies are highly trained. We've always balanced the need to apprehend someone versus the risk to the public. And that's always been in our pursuit policies here for as long as I can remember. And even when we could pursue, we would terminate pursuits if it became too dangerous based on, time of day, the number of, traffic that was present, as opposed to if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're on a wide open road and there's no traffic, that's a different situation. But again, we also employ spike strips, pit maneuvers, things to try and end pursuits quickly so that they don't endanger additional people. So again, when you return next session, I would just ask that you consider and really look into moving to that reasonable suspicion standard and allowing deputies and officers to use their training and their experience to determine what's an appropriate application of our pursuit policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Executive Sidhu, thank you for participating and your turn to comment.
Good morning. Somehow I'm unable to turn my camera on, whatever technology is. I just wanted to add that, when we look at it, we are in it. We are in the system. We are looking at the nuances of our system. Why couldn't this be approved? Why cannot that be approved? But I just want to give you perspective from the street. A common person, a small business owner, doesn't have patience or to understand nuances of how we pass bills or don't pass bills and what are the problems. I'm starting to get emails now. The simple slogan is, my taxes are going up and crime is going up. I have no protection. I have no trust. I think we need to keep that in perspective, and this is going to the mayor and myself. So I just wanted to share that this is kind of emails I'm getting from average citizen. Thank you.
Thank you. And Senator Sefcik, I've seen your hand pop up a couple times. I want to give you a chance to get a word in edgewise here.
No worries. Yeah, I was just going to add to 5919 briefly. Rep Rommel's analysis is correct in terms of the history. We had every member in our caucus voting for the conference committee, and then we had, I think it was 2 senators from the other party, and we had been committed that we did have at least 3, and I guess one of those members pulled out. So basically, it failed by 1 vote, but we were really hoping that we could have accepted the amendments in the conference committee. So that's a little more of, like you said, the sausage that you referenced earlier.
I just want to interject that I appreciate the introduction that Representative Rammel gave at the outset, especially in light of Executive Sidhu's report on comments he's getting. And just to remind everybody that this is a bit of a ping pong match because the initiation of these reforms came from a very distinct lack of trust in law enforcement and criminal justice from other portions of our community. So they were good faith attempts to address those concerns, and now there's a balancing act going on. So I think it's difficult to meet both perspectives and the needs of the entirety of the community. But I appreciate the effort that our electeds are making in this pretty critical arena. And Arlene, I thought I saw your hand up there. You're muted, Arlene. You're muted.
Yeah. I appreciate what you're saying, Stephen, because politics, what is politics in any case is what? The art of the possible. And the battle between forces that are being played out amongst the legislators and us, right, in this organization. And the larger perspective, the big perspective is a sort of revolution in criminal justice, right? We're moving from a punishment system, a punitive system, hopefully into a restorative system, a system that avoids heavy punishment as an answer to dealing with crime. So whatever system we're in, it has drawbacks and problems, and we're constantly having to fix it. But try to remember that we are in a large movement. It is a nationwide movement. It's been going on for quite a while, and it's still in the earlier stages. So we're part of that, whether we like it or not. And we are going to be complaining about the imperfections.
Thank you, Arlene. I want to thank everybody who's reported so far and ask if any of the other task force members have comments or questions of our elected officials. Councilmember Hamel.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. Thanks, reps and Senator. Appreciate you being here this morning to talk about these very important issues. My question, politicians love to hear their own voices. I'm not going to sit here and like talk for 5 minutes or whatever, but I do want to acknowledge that we're in a very significant time. That old adage of "may you live in interesting times" has happened. That's where we're at right now. I think the pendulum has swung. It's going back and forth. My question to you is, as state representing us in Olympia, what is the game plan moving forward for behavioral health issues, of which our officers report that 70% of their calls have some kind of behavioral health component? So I want to understand what you see as solutions at the state level for behavioral health.
It's too bad Alicia's not here, but I will try and channel her knowledge on this. Some of the things that there is money for an alternative response center in the budget for Whatcom County, an alternative response service, I think. We funded the Maplewood facility, the enhanced facility. There's a few other mental health pieces. There's still a bigger pot of grants. Like, we were looking at a map, and Whatcom County is underserved when it comes to behavioral health pieces here. So there's all that work out in Division Street, and I think we need to build more of that out. Some of the other pieces that Alicia did that are really exciting, there's basically $3 billion more in the budgets for school and school salaries, and it's about $1 billion more for counselors in K through 12. And so when we're thinking about this, I mean, gosh, the earlier you can get someone in crisis, the better. It just doesn't make sense to wait until they're, chief tanks or deputy chief, I'm losing names, their problems, but instead, if we can identify these things earlier. So I think that's really exciting. I'm probably missing a whole bunch of other behavioral health pieces as well. But I really appreciate the work that y'all are doing too on this task force, and I'm super excited to see these local partnerships. our job is often to go get the money for facilities like this. And it's the locals' job to go ahead and implement them and figure out what the community needs. And so I'll turn it over to my colleagues here to fully go on that.
Senator Stefzik.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to mention it is a huge issue. It's something I had a good conversation with Council Member Buchanan a few months ago about, which is that, you know, I think when you talk to law enforcement officials as well, you know, that they will say fully that their interest is in providing the behavioral health resources to these individuals. It's not necessarily some sort of you know, traditional criminal justice type response. So I think that's the issue of balance that we're talking about. That's so critical. The question is, you know, providing the resources, and I think we've made good steps there. But you know, I'm sure you've heard all the time about individuals that are brought into, for example, a hospital that there's either not necessarily a capacity for them or not a real ability, not enough staff to take care of individuals that clearly need some of these mental health resources. So it's a huge issue, and it's one that we have to address both by supporting our law enforcement and for supporting those other forms of relief as well.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Bramble.
Sure, thanks. And I really appreciate the question, Dan, because it sort of zooms us out from the specifics of what's happening right now to bigger, longer term systemic change that can make our community both safer and more just at the same time. So you and I talked last year about the expansion in behavioral health and addiction recovery programs. Those were funded at the end of last year and are just beginning to ramp up this year. And in part because of the federal funding that we received, we had more money to invest this year, and we put another $100 million into those priority triage, diversion programs, those kinds of community-based services. And another $100 million across all of Washington state. Most of that money isn't allocated community by community yet. It's just a big pot that's in the budget that needs to be allocated on a sort of a pro rata basis or a grant basis. So that money will be reaching communities like Bellingham, Whatcom County in the near future. But you're exactly right. That's the direction we have to be focusing on.
And can I add one more thing? Alicia and I were talking about this for a long time, and something that she said just keeps sticking with me. And that's, you know, these last 2 years have been really hard on a lot of folks. And I mean, no wonder mental health is in crisis. And I think one of our bigger jobs is making people's lives fun again and making them worth living and bringing back things that are important and get you outside and get you connected with people. So all the ways that we can make things more affordable, we can provide opportunities for outdoor recreation and indoor recreation, and just those human connections are going to be really important.
Executive Sidhu.
Yeah, I just wanted everybody to know that our council was very supportive that we are actually started a pilot on alternate response team. Now, this is something we started a year ago, and we are glad that Alicia was working on this, and we got some money, more money. I'm not sure how much we did get, but council approved over $2 million to get this thing. And we have started a pilot within Bellingham. And my wish is that within 2 years that we can have this thing rolled out countywide. And it's a great step from where we were 2 years ago and where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan and then Perry.
Yeah, just quickly want to add on to the executives' comments regarding alternate response team. That was that came out of the Behavioral Health Committee for the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force a couple of years ago, and then COVID hit, and then we had to put our plans on hold. So we've been working on that, and we will deploy 2 teams in Bellingham to respond to about 22 to 25 calls per day. And I agree with the Representative Shoemake's comments about starting early. I see Heather Flaherty's on this call. Heather and I and others have worked on a children's initiative, and we believe that going upstream as early as possible to create good interventions with people when they're kids. It's easier to invest in children, and it's less expensive and better outcomes than it is to fix broken adults when they're in our system. And so I don't want to see anyone in our Sally Port of the jail. But if we could prevent that from happening because we could invest in children, then we've done the right thing. And so I agree. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Perry, and then Arlene.
Good morning, folks. Perry Maury, Human Services Supervisor, and I just wanted to follow up on Executive Sadhu's statement that indeed we have received a supplemental budget of $2.2 million for building out our alternative response team base. And so some fantastic support. I just wanted to bring that piece of detail.
Thank you, Perry. Arlene.
Sorry, could I ask just one quick follow-up question on that? Perry, is that out of the federal Recovery Act dollars, or was that a state grant?
My understanding is it's general fund state appropriation.
Okay, thanks.
Arlene?
Yes, you're really describing the system that we have, the full system. And I just wanted to emphasize the fact that the last piece of the system is very lacking. And you're alluding to it because you're talking about behavioral health services. But once we have this wonderful alternate response team in action, the question is, where are they taking the people that are needing services? And do we have sufficient, which we do not? And that is the piece that's also very expensive too. And it's important to understand that and plan for it, because it will not do law enforcement any good not to have the response to the care that is needed, and the fast, immediate care is absolutely essential. One of the things we've been learning at, let's say, our last joint meeting, for example, is that the dragging out of services, the long line that it takes to get someone evaluated for competency for trial, which is what we were going over in that meeting, is unacceptable. It's too long, and people are being traumatized in the wait for services. So please do not overlook the fact that we have to have some really robust services to receive law enforcement. It's a whole system.
Yeah,
Thank you, Arlene.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly add that, Arlene, you're right. And that's what Sharon was talking, even during the session, we talked about that, how we can go from this 14-day and Deacon Center of Hope to a day 15 to like 6 months. And I think that's where we need to expand that facility and add, even we start with 16 beds. I just had a conversation with someone just last week that they are building a facility in Tacoma, public-private partnership, and where they will take care of this day 15 to day 6 months variable facility. I think something like that, we need to develop a public-private partnership like we're working on way station, something like that can come together. And we definitely need the alternate response team will be only successful if we have a place to take care of them. I totally agree.
Yeah, thank you so much. As you know, I have recommended in the past that we develop a 24/7 urgent care behavioral health for the Northwest. And I understand that it is probably necessary to do public-private partnership to raise the funds, but many communities have let different cities come together to try to put the money together to do this kind of service. crisis stabilization, to my understanding, does not receive anyone who's going to be assisted by law enforcement. It has not been that in the past. And if it is now, then it's changed in a way that I have not heard about.
I don't see any other hands seeking comment. Alex?
Quickly, we don't have time to go into the discussion, but I really appreciate that comment, and I'd love to follow up with you offline to better understand that recommendation, and especially how it relates to the new 988 emergency line for behavioral health crises that's been created that I think is going to be stood up later this year.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll follow up. Thank you so much for the chance to be here today.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Representative Hamel, Representative Shoemake, and Senator Sefcik for joining us. Really appreciate your work during the session and your reports today. Thank you to our local stakeholders for your input in the process and your participation in the conversation today. And I will say this shift in the discussion about the session into behavioral health and the system of services that surrounds law enforcement and criminal justice is unplanned, but a very nice segue into the next topic on the agenda. And so, Jack, I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, I was just thinking the segue is perfect. For those of you not familiar with the agenda item, the Justice Project Needs Assessment is in part picking up with the discussion of what does that look like in Whatcom County, meaning where will people be incarcerated? That is a large focus of this. And before I call on Barry, it's a personal privilege. Sharon, I got to thank you again for that Kendall Trail. Off topic, but you worked really hard. Thank you. It means a lot up there. People are really excited. All right, so we are talking now about the Stakeholders Advisory Committee and our Justice Project Needs Assessment. Again, thank you. If people need to leave, please feel free to do so. And Barry, I'll turn that over to you. And but I can start by saying, I think the first item is the committee chairs hosting the subject matter orientation. And I believe we have the Crisis Stabilization Center discussion on March 30th, Legal and Justice on April 4th, and Behavioral Health on April 15th. And Dan, Arlene, Raylene, Stephen, Barry are all and Perry are all involved in those.
Well, thanks, Jack. I guess that's my cue, eh? Yes, this is really turning into quite a fulfilling, very fact-gathering project that we're on. As you know, the Stakeholder Advisory Committee is working on creating a needs assessment to what we feel we need going forward for corrections and to make a holistic criminal justice system in which we really take a lot of consideration in behavioral health issues, as you know, we've just talked about. That's why, as Stephen mentioned, it's such a good segue. Committee chairs, I want to thank you so much, the subcommittee chairs, for stepping up when we came up with the idea that in order to get some of these Stakeholder Advisory Committee folks up to speed, they needed a little bit more detail out of what is going on in the community. So each of you volunteered to hold a session with Stakeholder Advisory Committee members that were interested, and that's upcoming. That'll be taking place between now and the first part of April. We had a kickoff for that last week. I believe, yeah, it was last week. It was a joint meeting of the Behavioral Health Subcommittee and the Law and Justice Subcommittee. I think that's going to be reported out, the details of that later, but that was a very good session. I actually had a couple of phone calls from folks that were attending in listen-only mode from the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and they really found a lot of value in the work that we're doing and craved more. So I think that's another thing I want to talk about kind of at the end of this discussion, is how we make sure that we keep a process going that keeps these folks educated and up to speed on everything that's going on. So we've got several work teams that have been convened. We have a planning team, which is largely Jack and I and Stephen and some of our staff that work to plan the activities for the Stakeholder Advisory Committee and then feed that information over to these work groups so they can develop a presentation for the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. The next meeting of that group is going to be on April 7th. The discussion will be around criminal justice data, and we have a data team that's been meeting weekly that's assembling criminal justice data and some of the data around lead and grace and how that impacts the overall numbers on our criminal justice system. The question is, how can we incorporate our SAC members into our subcommittee process on a, at least temporarily, an ongoing manner, so that they have a lot they need to learn in the coming months to be able to do their job. So, Dan, I know you had really expressed some interest that this is coming up because you brought it up in steering about your concerns, and I share your concerns as well. I think that we need to do everything we can to make sure everybody's on the same page and it's getting the same information. So if there's any ideas here going forward, the way we did it initially is we had folks at the joint meeting, they were in listen mode only, and then we're doing follow-ups with each subcommittee chair or co-chairs with selected, self-selected stakeholder advisory committee meetings, the ones that want to attend each of those meetings. So those won't be in listen mode. Those be interactive, so there could be questions asked along the way. So that's pretty much what is going on with the Justice Project right now. We're doing a lot of planning. Our third meeting was going to be on June 8th, I believe. And it'll be on behavioral health gap analysis and inventory. And that's another team that's been formed. Perry Mowry is leading that up, and I think he'll mention that in his report on the under committee updates. So that's all I had this morning. Jack, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Barry. And as he noted, we're meeting regularly, weekly, frequently, recognizing this is one of the major issues before Whatcom County, and there's obviously a natural synergy between the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force and the work of this committee. Are there any questions for Barry or Stephen or I or anyone else regarding that? Okay. I think the next item is implementation of the GARE toolkit. Stephen, you're welcome to take this if you want. I think, is this Dan? I'm not sure who this is. I apologize, Dan, if it isn't you. I know you know a lot about it.
I'll start this. Again, beginning with a little bit of background. Over a year ago, the task force committed itself to using the racial equity toolkit in its decision-making and recommendations, and followed that up by urging the county to become a member of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which, to its credit, the council and Executive Sadoo followed through on. So we are now a member of GARE. Councilmember Hamill at a recent meeting rightly noted that we haven't really done much in a concrete way to implement and to use the racial equity toolkit in our work as a task force. The steering committee took that up and is prepared, and you see it in your materials, prepared to use the 6 questions that comprise the racial equity toolkit. It's an analytical framework for decision-making that is both thorough, community-based, and focused on race equity. In all of our work, and Councilmember Hamill, again, quite insightfully noted that you would use those questions both at the outset of a discussion and a consideration of action options, in the middle as you weigh options, and in the end when you make a decision or forward a recommendation to the next level. In the steering committee, we thought that it would be valuable to formalize that process, both as a reminder, as a prompt to our groups doing this work, and as a record to the public that we've actually taken seriously and documented the use of the racial equity toolkit. So you see the questions in the materials. Our thought in the steering committee, and I open it to comments from Dan and then from the committee, was to use something of a template, a format that each subcommittee or the task force would fill in, that would document the ways in which we grappled with those questions and the way we came to make the recommendation or take the action that we ultimately did. So I'm a little bit unclear, and Jill was as well, whether this is an action item for the task force. Really, all we're talking about is a way of implementing a decision that we've already made. But welcome comments on that question too. Dan, do you want to have more that you added, since you really were sort of the catalyst for this latest stage of racial equity work?
Sure. Look, I want to give Mike Parker credit where credit is due. Credit needs to be given to him for pushing through this racial equity toolkit out of the Behavioral Health Committee. What I don't want to do is I don't want to sit here and pay lip service to an idea that is profound and important, and that is making sure that every person in this community has representation, and that we create equity in the work that we do. We just spent the last hour talking about top level state legislation, and we didn't apply a single equity framework to the entire discussion. To me, that's a waste of time. There are BIPOC community members. There are people that have low incomes in this community. 43% are asset limited, income constrained, and employed. Where's their seat at the table? How do we represent them? How do we represent them in the recommendations that we make to the county council, or that I would take back to city council? This is not rocket science. This is 6 steps of a framework for us to make decisions that include race and equity. It was brought up before, pardon me, I'm getting over COVID. I got it about a month ago and still trying to catch my breath. It was brought up before George Floyd's tragic murder last year that stopped everyone and in their tracks and made us think about what it's like what it's like to consider equity in decisions and policies and fairness. And so that's what I'm asking for. That's all I'm asking. I don't think it's a big ask. We don't do it as a practice, and we need to. I'm as guilty as anybody of that in my committee. I should be bringing that forward every single time. We had an opportunity at the joint meeting last time, and it's clunky in terms of like, how do you do it, and what's the framework, and how do we talk about it? But we need to have that conversation. We need to have that conversation because it's the right thing to do. It's that simple. So that's what I'm asking for. I'm asking that we apply an equity lens on every decision. Stephen, you brought it up, beginning, middle, and end. And if it takes us an extra hour, then it's worth it, in my opinion. I'll stop there.
So, Jack.
Dan, just from a process perspective, would you recommend then that the whole task force have a conversation on what that process looks like? I think philosophically, the task force would certainly be in alignment with this, but it reminds me of, like you said, how do we do it? And I don't know if it's you or someone else coming up with some suggestions of how we do it, but it would seem to me that the logical way to execute this is to figure out in a reality-based discussion, decision-making process like we have, how do we do it? Because on that, I'm unclear.
No, I get it. Arlene had her hand up. Sorry about that.
You're muted, Arlene.
I've been thinking a lot about the specifics of how do you actually do this. And for me, it's I'm trying to reach out to people that I know who can give us feedback. And we've been asked by the stakeholders group, for example, to reach out to 3 to 5 individuals and get their input on the planning process of the justice system plan that we're going to be talking about. That means to hear their voices clearly from them. And so that means that if anybody on this committee has any contacts in any other community, which I'm sure Heather does, then we need to invite them in, pull them in, urge them in, entice them in, whatever it is that we need to do to give feedback and to talk about their experiences, because we're not the whole system. That's just it. We're just this piece. And if we don't have those voices, what are we doing?
Heather.
Good morning, everybody. Heather Flaherty, citizen representative. A couple of things come to mind. I completely agree with you, Councilmember Hamel, about the conversation we just had and how much more effective it might have been had we applied these 6 simple questions that are in the packet. And Jack, when I hear your question about how could we apply this, a couple things I think about. One is, what is the purpose of the task force? And what decisions do we actually get to make and or recommendations? And we could actually be very well positioned to help apply a racial equity toolkit to issues like what we just discussed this morning. And if you look at that first question proposal, what is the policy, program, practice, or budget decision under consideration? I think those 4 things are a great trigger for when do we build in these 6 questions and ask and answer them. What are the desired results and outcomes? That, I think if we applied that to that conversation from the get-go of this morning about all of the legislation for police reform, we might have gotten to a different place. And then data, what does the data say? That's just, I mean, these are just solid, basic, good questions to ask anyway when we're making recommendations. And I think the most important is who will be impacted and who might benefit or be burdened by these policy or program or practice or budget decisions. And that's the work that we can do that Arlene just mentioned, reaching out to those communities and going to them. It's not just about removing barriers for them to participate here, but actually going to those communities. And we would need to build that in some mechanism, but I think that's really important. And then evaluation. So I just think it's simpler than it might seem to apply the toolkit, and also really rich and complex. But I think even just starting with asking those 6 questions when we are considering different policies, programs, budgets, or practices would be a good start. And I want to say that we're going to get it wrong 1,000 times. And that's sort of the point, is that it's continuous improvement and it's a lifelong commitment. And I think we can have grace and humility with each other about how we learn together, about how we do this well.
The idea of documenting the toolkit was more of a prompt so that we didn't engage in hour-long conversations without ever getting to these questions. They were right in front of our face and we had to confront them. So it's just a tool. I think it's a valuable beginning tool if we used it. But as Heather said, it looks simple, but it's far from it. It's building a system much like we intend to build a behavioral health treatment system and a recovery system that needs to be there, that isn't there. There are some real challenges buried in those 6 simple questions. We will find that, as we already know, but we'll find repeatedly that we don't have the data that we want to have to base something on. We do not have a community engagement process. We do not have people to talk to and find out their views on the effects of decisions we're contemplating. We're going to have to create those lines of communication, those relationships, and those structures. And it is going to be an ongoing thing. But I think the value of Dan's passion is to get us started on this and not to wait any longer, because we've waited too long already. Jack.
So my suggestion would be, if we're going to ask those questions, which seems like a place to begin, what I found in other organizations, I'm thinking of one in particular, we had a set of questions we always asked for any motion, action, or proposal, like how does this impact, what does it cost, etc. So what I would recommend as a possible course of action is that somebody put something simple together, that's that lens and those questions, and then that be brought to the task force as a potential tool that we use whenever we make a decision. We could send that out in a packet in advance of the meeting. And I think that would be a logical next step. And then we would discuss that and fine tune it and do it or not do it. But I think that would be the appropriate way to proceed. And it seems like it's one way to go. A good way, Heather. So yeah, so thanks for the suggestion.
And my further thought on this was that as we address those questions, we note the content of what comes out in response to them, and we post that for the public to appreciate that hesitant as it may be, hesitant not in reluctant, but hesitant as in fits and starts, that we are actually tackling this, that we are actually having these discussions. We are trying to make decisions with these considerations foremost in mind, as well as we can. And there's some record of that to refer back to. So I too think that would be a good beginning point as we dive into some of the other work that's necessary to do this.
Even though I've seen similar things work in the past, the person making the motion, the proposal, the action would generally almost fill it out. Like they would start out and that becomes the de facto record, but it may be enhanced through the discussion. Other people may notice other things. But what it does do is it forces what I think Councilman Hamel wants, which is some mindfulness or awareness of it. It forces people to pause and take a little moment to think about those things. And there may be cases where there's no impact at all. And that's what you say, there isn't any. That's fine if that's the case, or there may be significant. But what it does do is require that reflection or awareness be applied as decisions and actions are being made. And that, I think, could be the value in it.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me, Jack. Dan?
I just want to underline what Jack just said in terms of mindfulness. I think that's a great word when it comes to the decisions that are levied here. And there's one other tool that I want to make sure that we have in our tool belt, and that's the Racial Equity Commission that is in play right now. It's an asset that we have, and we should be able to lean on that group for advice, for consideration, and for help. And Heather Flaherty is absolutely correct. We're gonna muddle our way through this, and that's fine. That's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. I think that when human beings make mistakes, that they learn from that greater than when they don't. And so I think that's okay, and to accept that in this process.
Heather.
Thanks for bringing up the Racial Equity Commission. We are hoping that will be launched later this year. And that is one purpose that in the design is that it would be a body that you could go to for resource and support on answering some of these questions. And I could definitely foresee joint committee meetings in the future to discuss different policies and how they might impact people of color in particular. So thank you, Dan, for reminding us of that.
Any other comments on this? I think we have a faint trail for moving forward on this. Brian, I see you unmuted. Did you have a comment?
No, I'm just writing down kind of questions as we're going on, and some of the challenges, like one in particular is community engagement. How's that going to look? How are we going to interact with either minority communities or smaller kind of subcommittee or communities within Whatcom County? I mean, I bet we could have an entire meeting on methods and strategies on how to interact. But if as a committee, almost coming up with our standard on how we're going to engage specific groups that we want to maybe invite and even talk about, you know, what's the best way to communicate with them, what's important to them, because we can sit here all day and say, okay, I think this group, this is probably what's important to them, but I would love to actually hear from a lot of those members. You know, maybe they can be invited as guests, maybe we have, you know, smaller meetings. I don't know the answer there, but I think Mr. Hamill's right in pushing this toolkit and getting us more engaged. I think it's definitely going to be in the right direction and in our best interest too.
I think you're absolutely on target. This is not an exercise in speculating what other people might think. It's actually talking to other people and getting their input and figuring out how to do that in the most effective way is going to take a little bit of thought and work on our part.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you all for this input, and we'll keep this topic front of mind. Jack, want to take the next topic?
Sure.
I think actually Perry is going to weave the sequential intercept
Absolutely.
update into some other stuff that he's going to talk about.
And I think most people know what the sequential intercept model is about. If not, Perry, I'm assuming you'll likely explain it, but this is something that's been with us, gosh, 4 or 5 years, I would say. But I know we have a few new people, so it might be useful, Perry, to give a very brief reminder of why we have this sequential intercept model and how we believe it's important to be a living document. Like as Arlene mentioned earlier, you need some things at the end to take people, and we hope to plug some things in at different points in this model. So with that, why don't you go ahead and proceed?
Absolutely. Yes, and I believe if folks have the packet that was for the task force this morning, it's actually in the lower part of the packet if you want to reference it. Really short version of the what we refer to lovingly as the SIM, the sequential intercept model, is really a map around intercept locations for starting with community services, through law enforcement, through involvement in court hearings and detentions, while involved in jails, courts, also with reentry and then post-incarceration. So it looks at those opportunities to support individuals, and the SIM that was created in 2020 that is in your packet at this point breaks that further down into the first page is programs that are currently in place in the community. The next page is community services that do exist but are suffering from gaps or need more support. And then the third page is programs that are needed that were identified and are not yet in existence. Again, this was developed within the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force in 2020. And so it's outdated. We thought that it would be a really good framework and map to start to take a look at from where we were to where we are. It's going to be interesting because of the pandemic that was occurring during those periods of time. So hopefully that's enough of an explanation in terms of the sequential intercept model and what the framework of that component is as well. We kicked off a behavioral health gap analysis group last week on Wednesday. Barry Buchanan and Erica Lautenbach, basically brought us together as a group, as a small group, to do just an initial update of the sequential intercept model from the knowledge that is in that group of, I believe it's about 7 or 8 people. Again, going through that, brainstorming, individuals sort of working on their own in a sequential intercept map, and then coming back together, discussing that, maybe elaborating further, and using that that knowledge base to update, to bring it a bit more current. In addition, the responsibility of that group, as I understand it, is also consistent with the discussion that we were just having, was to look at various groups and or individuals that are in the community that we can then take that model to with some updated components that would, just some of the ideas we haven't gathered. Again, we'll obviously be gathering this Wednesday, but some of the ideas that were even tossed around in the initial meeting was behavioral health entities, community behavioral health providers, that sort of thing, NAMI, for example. And so we just wanted to generate a whole lot of thoughts and discussions about what we would do with the SIM as we had developed it to the level of our knowledge and ability, but then also reaching out. Further from that, the meetings continue to be set up at this point from, as I mentioned, last Wednesday through the end of May, and I think even into early June, because another component of developing the SIM from where it is now is also to begin to apply a, should I put it, an approach or a model to the cost of those programs, to be able to bring that information forward as well, and discuss sort of how did we apply that equation to those settings, and what would that potential cost be. So I'm excited about being a part of it. This discussion that we had just previous to this was a great reminder. I will certainly bring that particular piece of information to the group in terms of our awareness relative to a racial equity lens. Those individuals that we need to get input from, and continue to update that model as a collective within the community. I think that that's enough information at this point. I'm looking forward to being a part of that project and working with the folks that are involved in it at this point.
Great, thank you, Perry. Are there any questions for Perry about the sequential intercept model? All right, I think we are going to, oh, Dan, keep wanting to say Dan, Councilman Hamel.
You can say Dan or whatever. I've been called worse. So I think that we need to have the conversation at some point. I don't know if it's, I don't think it's a now, but I think at some point about going backwards on the sequential intercept model. We added 0, which I think was a really good step. And for those not aware, 0 is like pre-arrest. Basically, it's community programs that help people kind of stay on track, basically. But I'm wondering, given the fact that we're looking at a children's initiative in November, what does that look like for having a -1 or a -2, and how far back does this group, pardon me, want to go when it comes to investments in pre-arrest? So it's just kind of food for thought.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, I think we're going to move to the committee updates. I can go ahead and start, and Stephen, you take the next one, but I will start with the steering committee. And I know Councilman Buchanan, you already gave us sort of an update on a lot of what we talked about in the steering committee, but if you'd like to add anything else, if you're available, that'd be great.
Well, I think we covered not only the stakeholder advisory committee and the Justice Project but we also have covered the sequential intercept model. That we had that discussion. We talked about GARE. So I think we've covered everything so far that we covered in the steering committee, Jack.
That was sort of my impression. I couldn't think of anything else really. We just did it not here. So,
Yeah.
okay, perfect. Stephen, why don't you go ahead and take behavioral health and the joint meeting, please?
Sure, thank you, Jack. Dan, I'll offer you a chance to talk about the February 15th behavioral health meeting to the extent you want, and then have you and Arlene talk about the very rich joint meeting between behavioral health and the Legal and Justice Systems Committee.
Okay, I don't have my notes up for the February meeting. I just have the ones for the joint.
Okay, but well, people can refer to their packet for the notes on the February 15th behavioral health meeting. And I think it's more important at the moment to report and hear discussion about the joint meeting anyway. So however you two want to coordinate that report, take it away.
Sure. Arlene, do you want to go, or how do you want to do it?
No, you go ahead, but I guess I look at it more from a larger picture. I'm looking for themes and problems and issues. So, but it was very detailed meeting. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I want to provide some context and framework in terms of why I felt the meeting was very important. And part of that was the stakeholder advisory committee members showing up. We had 53 or 54 people on that call. When's the last time anyone showed up for in that amount for any of the subcommittee meetings? So it was very well attended, both on the committee sides and the stakeholder advisory group. And I bring that up because I think it's very important to underscore the short timeline that group has in terms of kind of getting up to speed and understanding all of the complexities of the issues that we're facing. The last two ballot measures for the jail did not pass. The first one barely lost. The second one lost by a wide margin. And I think part of that is that the community was very impatient with the fact that we were not addressing behavioral health issues in any kind of meaningful capacity. And part of that is that, and Arlene brings this up all the time, is that we don't tell our story very well. We have a good story to tell. We have Grace and LEAD. We're going to have the alternate response team. We have community paramedic for non-criminogenic pieces. We have the crisis stabilization center. We have deep investments, the home fund, the 1590 housing dollars. We have deep investments in our community that are helping to prevent incarceration. And we don't talk about it in a way that is beyond the black boxes that I see on the screen before me today. That is disappointing. We need to get that story out there that we are doing good work, and we're facing challenges. We face extraordinary challenges that cannot be solved at the municipal or the county level. And yet we're taking them on because we've got this grit and this determination and this forward-facing, eyes wide open. Let's bring it, bring the challenges. Let's do this. And so that's what we talked about to some extent in the joint meeting. We had 6 agenda items before us in the joint meeting. We got through 1. And because the discussion was so rich on competency and restoration, from Susan Copeland, Darla Dawson, Eric Nygaard, and Thomas Kinlan from DSHS. And there was a lot of back and forth. Chief Jones was there discussing the challenges that everyone's facing in terms of trying to get competency restoration through the 4 facilities that we have, Western State, Eastern State, Maple Lane, and I forget the other one off the top of my head here. Arlene was spot on. This is a system, and that's what and the system has like multiple components and silos within each system that prevent us from effectively providing some types of restoration. it's challenging. We talked for 2 hours, well, just about almost 2 hours. We went over, and I think that those stakeholder advisory committee members got an earful when it comes to understanding how challenging this is, and how much how much distance we have to go when it comes to helping those that are most vulnerable and those that are committing crimes in the community. Arlene, I'm gonna have you probably take over here. My voice is going out. Go ahead.
Well, the Wendy Jones spoke extensively about all of the details that are involved in the competency hearing process. And it really mattered mostly for understanding the process and how long and complex it is, but especially the absurd timelines, which I guess are typical of administrations and governments. But in the case of people who are severely mentally ill, is appalling. And it's just accepted as, you know, this is what we do and this is how we do it. And we don't have enough this and we don't have enough that and so on. So our task, of course, here is to recommend what we need to have and try to see if we can get that. So that, hence the value of having the legislators here with us today. It's really important for that. It's so complex. I mean, every time I start to think about it, it's sort of a little bit overwhelming, but I feel determined and I feel really happy that we're on this path, because I think that we're marching towards important changes and expansion of, especially of the mental health system. That's what I want to see happen. It's very lacking, it's very needed, and all those gaps that Perry's talking about need to be filled. And this is our opportunity. If we can get this bill passed, then we'll have the funding for what we want to do, at least some of it. And I made it my business to find out about the jail in great specific detail by meeting with some people who have worked in the jail. And let's just say I got an earful of the unacceptability of the whole system in there. And most importantly, I think it's important for everybody to understand how much serious mental illness we have in the jail. And Wendy did emphasize that, speaking in percentages of 80 to 90%, huge. Okay, so the fact that they're actually being treated or not treated mostly in the jail. So all of that has to get shifted and changed in some way or other. And I don't have all the answers to that, but I know that it needs to be, that care needs to be possible in the jail, and that the subject we didn't get to, which was reentry, and a huge important subject, has to be very robust. And even after that, there has to be aftercare, continuing aftercare. And we are beginning to talk frequently about navigators who are supporting people's stability and sobriety. So that's that after piece. And today you've been talking about the before piece, you know, prevention, and that is absolutely essential. And we are getting started on it, but we're of course not there yet. Because when all those nurses and extra counselors come into the schools, where are the family therapists who are on duty right away to visit with those families, support those families, help those families? Where are they? Right? So the system, again, you know, the system has to be complete and thorough. And the way that you will see it is in the figures on pieces of paper. That's how you could see whether or not it's strong enough and robust enough to build what it needs to be built.
Heather, you have a comment?
I do have a comment, if I may. That meeting was really interesting. And one thing that struck me was the what's the incentive for getting somebody a competency hearing or restored? I'm not sure I'm using all the right words, but the incentive, I understand, is from the state's perspective or the government's perspective to get somebody competent enough to be charged with their crime and tried, and there's the accountability piece. But what if the incentive was, we want to stabilize and rehabilitate and help this person become a productive member of society, versus we want them to be competent enough to be punished for what they did? And I just think that just really struck me as a difference in incentives. I also, as it relates to the mental illness that we see in our jail and the co-occurring substance use disorders, and the discussion around what is next for that infrastructure from the county's perspective, and this push to make sure that treatment's available in the jail, which I think is important. But I also feel compelled as a citizen representative to say, we want treatment available outside of the jail as well. We don't want people to have to be arrested to get the treatment that they need. And I have an intern at the Chuckanut Health Foundation who has done analysis on our jail population from January 2020 to July of 2021. And we have some great data on what are the top repeated offenses that are in our jail. And the highest one, according to what we've been able to see with booking data, is DUIs. Do we really need a big, giant, hardened facility to deal with DUIs? And my understanding is we don't actually have a lot of great resources in the community to help address DUIs preventatively or rehabilitatively. So again, let's apply that 6-question racial equity toolkit and say, what does the data say, before we talk about what's next and what we need to build. So that's my perspective, and I just wanted to add that, and thanks for letting me.
Another example of what Heather is talking about was the research that the Law and Justice Committee did on domestic violence and behavioral health also. And the lack of qualified clinicians to work with perpetrators, people who commit the violence, which is the key. It's a key piece, right? I mean, we want these people not to offend again, not to hurt another human being. And the treatment is not simple. It's a complex set of problems that have to be addressed by someone well-trained. And what did we find? We found that we did not have the treaters that we needed. We don't have them. Okay, so that's just another example.
I had the honor of sitting in on the joint meeting also, and I want to echo Dan's and Arlene's sense that this was an unusually in-depth kind of consideration. I've been on the task force since it began years ago, and I came to see that I've been like in a surveillance satellite well above the system, watching the whole spectrum of things. But I understood for the first time how surveillance satellites can increase the resolution and read license plates and so forth. And this was like reading a license plate. It was like going from first appearance in court where there is enough suggestion of mental illness to ask the question, does this person understand the charge, and can this person assist in their defense? Basic questions. How that can take a months-long process winding between here and the South Sound and back again. All just to get to the point of having a trial. So just a tiny segment of the longitudinal system that I've been looking at was, incredibly complex and presented, incredible multi-system challenges. So it was really, it was a wake-up call to how hard this work is to me. And I really appreciated Chief Jones's leadership and the information she provided. There's a flow chart if you want to look at the committee materials for that she provided. Anyway, very valuable meeting. Thanks to you two for coordinating that. Other questions or comments from anyone? Dan?
Just wanted to throw out that we're going to be meeting here again in a joint capacity and inviting the Stakeholder Advisory Committee to attend. This is with the sense of urgency that is being felt regarding the SACS work, but also that we had a number of agenda items that we just didn't get to because we drilled in pretty deep into competency and restoration. And I think it was a valuable discussion that we learned quite a bit. And one of the things that was striking was that substance use disorder, there's no licensure for that for the folks that are treating for mental health illness. That's a huge issue to me when we're facing right now some of the most potent and dangerous drugs that have ever been known to humankind: phenylpropanol, methamphetamine, which is, it ain't your daddy's meth, as they say. This is nasty stuff that causes psychosis within the first or second use. When you have, I work downtown, I work 4 blocks that away. And when I see people that are in deep psychosis, it's very worrisome for their health when they wander into traffic because they feel like the cars cannot hurt them, or they're vulnerable to predators. And then combine that with fentanyl and carfentanil, which carfentanil is basically an animal tranquilizer and that people use. And so you can see the compounding factors that go into place on top of people's if they have a mental health illness and they're using these types of drugs. What is the solution? And to me, I didn't find one. I didn't find a solution at the meeting. And so I'm very concerned that people will further deteriorate on top of a pandemic that's lasted over 2 years. People's limbic systems and their central nervous systems have taken a huge hit. And now we're talking about these street drugs that are terrible. So I think the more, and I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be that way at all this morning here, but the more that we dig into it, the more complicating factors are revealed. And Arlene's absolutely right. We need to have domestic violence perpetrator treatment programs that are robust and effective in this community when it comes to that terrible crime that is committed to on people that are vulnerable, including children. So we need to have those resources available here. Our work is cut out for us. We have much to do. I think that those joint meetings are very advantageous. And so I'm looking forward to the next one in April.
Thank you, Dan. And thanks to you again, Arlene. Look forward to the April meeting. Jack, you want to handle other business and public comment?
Sure. I am not aware of any other business. Is anyone else? Well, seeing none, I will do the easiest thing, which is I will turn it over to Jill, who is extraordinarily competent at doing the public comment with the people we have. I think we're down actually to one attendee right now. But Jill, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Jack. You're correct. We have one attendee. If you would like to speak to the task force, please virtually raise your hand now.
And thank you.
No raised hand.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for the, thank you, Peter, for attending. We see you there in the participants thing. So with that, I'm not aware of any other announcements we have. Thank you to everyone. It's obvious we're getting a lot of things done, especially thanks to the co-chairs. I know that a lot has fallen on you with all the SAC stuff, so thanks for your extra efforts. And with that, we are adjourned.